Chapter 6. A Noisy Contraption. "Maudie, Maudie, wake up!" Maudie stirred and sleepily opened her eyes to see Sarah bending over her. She rolled over and noticed through the window that the sky was still dark, so she closed her eyes again. "Maudie, you must get up," Sarah insisted. She gently shook Maudie's shoulder. "Mother had a baby last night." Maudie's eyes flew open and she struggled to sit up. "What? A baby?" She rubbed her eyes and swung her feet over the side of the bed. "Yes, Mother had a baby and it's a girl." "Is she going to be all right?" Maudie asked. "It looks like it. She's not crying anyhow." Maudie yanked her dress over her head and pulled on her stockings. "Where are my shoes?" she asked. "Right here." Sarah handed her shoes to her. "Come down right away and help me get breakfast ready. The boys will soon be getting up." "Brr, it's cold." Maudie's teeth chattered as she hurriedly pulled the blankets and quilt over her bed and straightened the pillow. Then she skipped downstairs. All was quiet in the kitchen. Father sat at the table with his head resting on his arms. "Shh," Sarah whispered to Maudie. "He's been up all night." But Father had heard her coming and lifted his head. He smiled and asked Maudie if she would like to see her baby sister. "Of course," she replied, grinning from ear to ear. Scraping back his chair, he stood, and his large frame seemed to fill the entire room. He stopped at the bedroom door and listened. Hearing low voices, he quietly opened it and looked inside. Lizzie Troyer, who lived across the railroad, was watching over Mother with sleeves rolled up and sweat beads glistening on her forehead. She motioned for him to enter. Father stooped over the cradle and lifted the tiny bundle from it, explaining that the girls wanted to see her. Maudie stretched up on tiptoes to see, so Father lowered the baby to her level. "Oh," Maudie whispered. She stroked the tiny face and felt her dark, damp hair. "What's her name?" "Mother says it's Lydia, after Grandma Yoder." "I like Lydia," Sarah said. "Me too," Maudie nodded. "Then Lydia it is," he answered. His large, rough hands tightened the soft cotton blanket around his newborn daughter. Gently he took her back to the cradle, then went upstairs to wake the boys. She heard him shouting, "Merry Christmas!" In a loud, happy voice. He shook and rattled the doorknob until it sounded as though it were coming off. "You have a new sister, boys," he added. "Oh, is it Christmas Day?" Maudie asked Sarah, her hand poised in midair. "Yeah, did you forget?" "I guess so." Sarah never forgot Christmas Day, and usually had a little gift for everyone. Maudie felt embarrassed to have forgotten it again. Next year she would be sure to make something. "Isn't it special to have a baby on Christmas Day? That's the best Christmas present ever!" Maudie exclaimed. A warm glow filled her. Soon her brothers filed down the stairs. They too wanted to see the baby. So Father brought her out to the kitchen. They each took turns holding her, and she lay still in their arms, never crying or squirming. She had soft pink cheeks and was the picture of health. Father seemed extra pleased with her, probably because Elizabeth had been so sickly. The sky began to lighten in the east, so the boys and Father quickly ate breakfast and went outside to chore. Lizzie came out of the bedroom and sank tiredly into a chair beside the table. Sarah prepared a plate of eggs and biscuits and gravy for her. "Will Mother be okay?" Sarah asked Lizzie. "Oh, yes. She's resting now and should be feeling much better by evening. Do you think you can take care of things the next few days?" "Yeah, I've got Maudie and Gidley to help, and with it being winter, there's not a whole lot to do," Sarah replied. Then I think I'll go home and check back with you toward the end of the week." As the days passed, Mother began getting up more and more, but did not take on household duties until the baby was about 10 days old. Little Lydia slept and slept, waking only to be fed. Mother regained her strength quickly, and the baby grew fair and chubby. One day Father returned from Buckland with news that their English neighbors to the east, the Powells, had a new baby in their house too. He had stopped there on his way home, and Mr. Powell told him about the birth and that the baby was tiny and sickly. He said he was nearly ready to call the doctor. Several mornings later, soon after breakfast, both Mr. and Mrs. Powell rode into their yard in their fancy carriage with their 2 yellow spotted horses. "Here come Lotback and Case," meaning apple butter and cheese, Gidley yelled as he ran to the porch to welcome them inside. Their horses were yellow, the color of cheese, with large brown spots like apple butter, so the children had given them their nickname. Mrs. Powell came up the steps to the front porch. "Come in," Gidley invited her as he opened the door wide. "Is your mother here?" she asked, stepping hesitantly inside. In her arms she held a tiny baby wrapped in a beautiful crocheted shawl. It was blue with a yellow border. "I'll go get her." Gidley ran to the bedroom where Mother was nursing Lydia. "Mrs. Powell is here and wants to talk to you." Mother laid Lydia in her cradle and went to the front door to meet her neighbor. "Good morning, Mrs. Powell," she greeted her. "How is the baby doing?" "Not very well," she replied wearily. "Mr. Powell went after the doctor last night, and he said I must find someone who can nurse my baby part of the time. The doctor's afraid he might die if he doesn't get some mother's milk and gain some weight soon." "Come and sit down," Mother invited her. After they were seated, Mother took the Powell's little baby in her arms and stroked his pale cheeks. She saw the pitifully thin arms and legs, and his sunken eyes. He puckered up his face and tried to cry. Mother's heart ached for him and Mrs. Powell. How well she knew the hopelessness of caring for an ailing child. Tears pricked her eyelids as she turned to her neighbor again. "I'll be glad to nurse him for you," she said softly. "Gidley, go tell Mr. Powell that he can go to the tool shed where Father is and pass the time with him while I nurse their baby." She turned to Mrs. Powell and asked her to come back to the bedroom with her. "I just finished nursing my baby, but I think I might have some milk left." Mrs. Powell stooped over the cradle, admiring baby Lydia. How healthy she looked in comparison to her son. She then sat on the edge of the bed to visit while Mother fed her son. Mrs. Powell told of the weariness that came from caring for her baby, and of the fear that clutched at her heart every single day. She longed for several hours of uninterrupted sleep, yet if the baby slept, she was afraid he would not wake again, so the fear kept her from really resting. How well Mother knew of what she spoke. How well she remembered the bone weariness, the heartless grave, and the numbing grief. She would do all she could to keep her neighbor from experiencing what she had. "Can you bring him back this evening?" Mother asked. "Yes, we can. How often do you think you can feed him?" "Well, I have plenty of milk, and Lydia is a contented baby. So why don't we try it every morning and every night?" "But your baby has to have her milk too, and I don't want her to get sick." "We'll watch everything real close and see how she takes it. Usually, the more you nurse, the more milk you have, so I should pick up in my supply in a couple of days. Let's try it once." So every morning and evening, one of the Powells brought their little baby to Mother to be fed. Soon he began gaining in strength and color. Mother decided to try feeding him at noon too, and before long she had 2 little babies growing and cooing contentedly. Then as spring passed into summer, the Powells brought their baby less and less, until he was coming to be fed only at noon. Many times the children saw Mr. Powell drive past in his fine carriage, pulled by his brown and yellow horses. One day, Sarah, Maudie, and Gidley were sitting on the front porch snapping green beans when they heard a strange noise over the slight rise in the road. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the Powells. They lifted their heads and listened. To their utter astonishment and wonder, the noise grew louder and louder until a strange-looking carriage came put-put-putting over the hilltop. Sitting proudly in the seat was Mr. Powell. The carriage rolled along past their house without being pulled by the yellow horses, or any horse, for that matter. It seemed to roll along on its own. Mr. Powell waved merrily, but they were too amazed to return his wave. "Mother! Mother! Come, look at what Mr. Powell is riding," Maudie cried excitedly. He'll not be able to go home in that thing, 'cause he can't make it roll back up the hill," Gidley stuttered. "I don't see how he can keep going so long across the prairie either," Sarah added. "You'd think he would have lost his speed a long time ago." "I know," Maudie agreed. They were puzzled. Mother stepped out onto the porch and strained her eyes to see him. By this time he was far away, and only a faint humming sound could be heard. "We'll see what that thing is when they bring the baby tomorrow," she told them. That evening, while they were out in the barnyard choring, they again heard the strange noise of Mr. Powell's carriage. Come quick, Dan and Jake," Gidley shouted. "Maudie, go in the barn and tell Father and Tobe to come look at Mr. Powell." The rumbling grew louder and louder until the animals began growing nervous. The children ran out to the road, waiting for their neighbor to ride by. "Get back," Maudie warned, but the boys would not listen. "He'll not be able to get back up the hill, will he?" Gidley asked the older boys. "No," Tobe and Jake answered together. "Well, I think he can," Sarah disagreed. "He went all the way across the prairie without being pulled and plumb out of sight." "Yeah, I think he can too," Father said, "because I've heard about these horseless carriages, and they can go anywhere a horse can, but they have their own power and don't need anything to pull them." The noisy contraption was drawing closer and closer, and Maudie wished the others wouldn't be so near to the road. Mother joined them with Lydia in her arms and Mary clinging to her skirt. As Mr. Powell came closer, he slowed the machine until it stopped before them. It was painted shiny black, and Maudie could see herself reflected in it. She moved a little to one side until she was directly in front of the door. Was she really as fat as her reflection appeared? She pushed a stray strand of hair from her eyes, and as she did that, she saw how short her arm looked shining in the carriage door. She lifted one leg and giggled. It looked as if it were only 6 inches long. "Oh, look how fat I am!" She tugged on Gidley's arm. They laughed at their reflections in the shiny black paint. Everyone looked short and fat. Gidley walked around to the brass lights that were bolted on the smooth black fenders and looked deep inside the round globes. Then he kicked the rubber tires. "You want to ride?" Mr. Powell shouted above the noise of the engine. He was grinning from ear to ear. Maudie backed up. She certainly would not take a ride in that thing. "Do you children want a ride?" Father asked them. They only stared. "Do you or don't you?" he asked again. They shook their heads and backed up. "Why don't you come with me, Chris?" Mr. Powell asked. "Should I?" Father turned to Mother. She laughed. "Go if you want to." So Father gingerly climbed into the seat beside Mr. Powell. There was almost not enough room for the 2 men on one seat, but Mr. Powell scooted over. Although they crowded both sides of the seat, they managed to sit comfortably. Mr. Powell reached down and moved a stick that projected from the floorboard. With his foot, he pushed on a pedal, and the carriage began to move. The children stepped back even farther, and Father looked up and waved at his family. It's not going to go up that hill. You just watch, Dan said. I know, Gidley agreed. With Father and Mr. Powell both in that thing, there was no way it could pull them up the hill. But it did. Soon the two men were out of sight. The children were astonished. To think that something could go uphill without anything pulling it, it couldn't be possible. But yet, that was what they had just seen happen. They waited a long time before Mr. Powell and Father came chugging down over the hill again and slowed to a stop. Father and Mr. Powell were laughing loudly. The engine began sputtering and coughing, so Mr. Powell pushed on the little pedal on the floorboard, and a smelly smoke poured out of a pipe in the back. Phew! Maudie and Sarah wrinkled their noses and turned away. The boys scoffed at them and said it smelled good. To tease the girls, Mr. Powell stepped on the pedal some more. Stop it! Maudie yelled. No, do it again, do it again! Gidley screamed, jumping up and down with excitement. So Mr. Powell sent out more clouds of smoke before moving the stick on the floorboard and turning the carriage around in their lane. Then he waved goodbye and chugged back up the hill toward his home. Never again would the children see Mr. Powell's horses that reminded them of Lotback and Case. Now he had a horseless carriage and wouldn't need horses any more. End of chapter 6.